Management 203 class. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about wage differentials. In other words, how do people get paid within collective bargaining agreements, specifically to organized labor? Some of the issues we're going to be discussing today also go beyond the realm of union environments and the general economic environments. But we're really going to determine why people get paid, what they get paid within the terms of a contract or collective bargaining agreement. So when we start talking about wage differentials, what are we talking about is basically what do people make and why? So for example, we've talked repeatedly through the semester that people in union environments tend to have better wages and benefits than people in non-union environments. Well, why is that? Well, we start talking about what we refer to as a standard of living. This is something that's very popular when we talk in political circles about people wanting to have a standard of living for their employees. Unions, for example, are really big on this sort of stuff. If we also look at the flip side of the equation, your standard of living is also limited by what your employer can afford. We also, however, want to make sure that we've got people not all being paid the same. In a socialist or communist economic system, there's very little dispersion. There's very little differential between wages. In a capitalist system, we like to think that, for example, people have the ability to make more money based on having skill. Well, that also depends on the amount of skill you're bringing to the equation. So, for example, if you've got a lot of competition in a particular market, whether or not you're a union or non-union shop, there's going to be more competition for good labor, meaning if you're good at what you do, you might make more money. Unskilled labor, not so much. And if we will recall, that's part of the reason unions came into prominence in the first place, was to help protect unskilled labor. So the bottom line is how much value are you adding to the raw materials? The United Auto Workers, for example, these are folks who turn parts into cars, as opposed to somebody who maybe works in a less skilled field. Those individuals may not add as much value, so that would determine how much pay they're going to get and the differential between skill sets within the same employer. So we start off, and this may sound very specific to human resource management, but it ties in to labor relations as well. We know what somebody is worth based on how much the job takes to do. How difficult is the job? Well, a job description, which basically summarizes everything it takes to do the job, contains something we refer to as a job specification. So the job description is the general grouping of everything you need to do the job. The specifications are the technical things that you would need. So for example, a job description might include, for example, that somebody who's teaching at St. Francis University might need a master's degree or greater. They might need good interpersonal skills, all these sorts of things. The job specification might get down to the type of master's degree or the type of skills required, the writing levels, writing proficiency. So the descriptions, the general gathering, the specifications of the individual criteria that would be needed. So how do we do job evaluation? How do we determine what a job is worth to an organization? Well, we can rank jobs, for example, from the least to most difficult. So for example, if you were in a medical unit doing brain surgery, the brain surgeon, him or herself, might be at the top of the ranking. They have the most complicated job, where somebody who's sweeping the floors working in the clinic maybe has a less complex job. So that would be a ranking method. We could also put jobs in the classifications. So we could group them based by things such as custodial or trades or IT. So we could group them into specific areas. We could also determine what we call a point system, which is compensable factors, meaning if we've got a job that is very difficult, it may have higher numbers of points associated with it than a job that's less difficult. So assigning total points, total value. If this stuff all sounds like HR, it's because it is. This is basic HR stuff, but it plays into collective bargaining agreement. So you can imagine that there are different opinions in terms of what the union and the company see as preferable in terms of how we determine wages. The company, for example, wants wage surveys and job evaluation. We want to see what other employers are paying and what those jobs actually take to do. The union, for example, wants to look at internal and external factors if they help them. And they also want to look at grievances. So, for example, grievances mean, is this job really difficult? Are people getting hurt all the time? All of these things play in. So the union will look at what's most favorable for them. The employer will look at what's most favorable for them. The takeaway message from this is that the unions typically are more focused on things like seniority than skill or or what other employers are paying. Although they will look at what other employers are paying if it'll do better for their benefits. A good recent example might be General Motors and Ford. For the United Auto Workers, when they went on strike against General Motors, Ford benefited from that because Ford was able to look at what the United Auto Workers negotiated with GM and to try to get ahead of that in the bargaining type of position. So in terms of some of the wage structures, let's say, for example, if you were going by labor grades, so a janitor might be at the bottom of that labor grade, and a machinist might be at the top. You can see they get different amounts of points. So this particular point system might determine your hourly rate, might even determine some of your other benefits, and definitely would determine your starting wages, for example. So a point system might be one method of determining your starting rate, probably used in conjunction, by the way, with seniority in most union shops. So in terms of how we do wage surveys, the U.S. Department of Labor actually does a couple of things. They have what they refer to as the National Compensation Survey and the Occupational Pay Relative Survey. And what those surveys do essentially are determine what people in specific industries are getting paid. We also have trade and professional groups. So if you belong to a particular manufacturing group, you might even have employer surveys or union surveys as well. One of the really great resources, too, we talk about in human resource management, the Department of Labor has a really great website called ONET. And ONET has a great database of just about any position you can imagine, any description you can imagine. It's a great place to go to get information on writing job descriptions. It's also a great place to see what specific professions are making in specific areas. So, for example, if we did a wage survey, we might have several employers who go in together to say we're going to see what the average person is making to try to determine for our positions what we should be making. So, for example, we look at the janitor title here. Out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 firms, this person is making the least in firm A, they're making the most in firm F. And the average wage, or should be average wager, is $11.67 an hour. There can be high amounts of dispersion or low amounts of dispersion between employers. And it's one of these things that's always a little risky when you do a wage survey between employers. On one hand, you might find out you're paying very well. On the other hand, you might discover your competition is outbidding you drastically. If that word gets out to the rank and file, it could cause problems in the fact that people would start wanting raises. So in terms of production standards, what we mean by that, if you go back to the old things like the Fayol studies and early industrial kinds of management studies, essentially we want to know what makes sense for production. How many cars can a group of employees reasonably make in an hour, for example? That's a standard. And so these standards, on the company side of things, we want to make sure that we're getting productivity, and we want to also attract employees. Oh, this is a place that's productive, but it's reasonable. And it also gives us ways to reward employees. If we get into pay structures, for example, there are things that include criteria such as hourly rates and piece rates, meaning that if you're working in a factory, you may have to make so many pieces per hour to be able to make your piece rate in addition to your hourly rate. So what about incentive plans? Companies, whether they're union or whether they're non-union, sometimes have things like lump sum bonuses, meaning if the company does well, everybody gets a payout. Or you get a profit sharing plan. At the end of the year, we made a profit, so we're going to take so much of the profit and reinvest in the company. We're going to take so much and reinvest in the people. All of these things can get negotiated as part of a collective bargaining agreement. And we also have skill-based pay, which means, okay, you went to training, you gained this skill or this certification, so we're going to give you a raise. In terms of other kinds of plans, there's something called the Scanlon plan, and that means, for example, if you're in organizational restructuring, or if you're trying to become more efficient in terms of use of labor, and you save money, the company can share it with everybody. Then we have what's called the Rucker plan, which means if we look at how much productivity per dollar we're getting, we might pay out a bonus based on per dollar value that's added. And the Impro Share plan means that, for example, if we are reducing the amount of labor that we need overall for a base type of labor, let's say, for example, it normally takes 10 people to make a car, and we get it down to 8, so we save 2 positions. It means that part of the money that comes from those 2 positions we get distributed to the other folks who are making better use of their time, for example. So in terms of determination, want to know the differences in the way we look at this stuff, some of the general factors are how hard is the job? Does the wage fit the job? For example, somebody who's doing brain surgery probably shouldn't be making minimum wage. Is the organization doing well? The big argument with General Motors, your company's making money, your CEO is making $20 million a year, you can afford to pay better. How efficient are your employees? Can you pay them because they're being productive? What is the cost of living in your area? For example, there's a big differential between New York City and Loretto, Pennsylvania, and what you'd have to pay somebody so they can earn a living. And what about legal requirements? Of course, we're talking about minimum wage and overtime. Some of the things you can look at competitive factors. How efficient is your company? For example, there were studies that showed that Toyota and Nissan and some of the Japanese manufacturers can make cars in much less time with fewer defects than American companies. So there would be an argument that maybe we could pay those people a little more. What about cost cutting? Are we going to more automation? Are we getting rid of people? And as an associated factor, are we being more productive? And then we get into internal factors as well. When we say firm-specific labor costs, is there something particular to your industry, why it costs money to do a particular job? How much money do you expect to make? What do you expect in profits? And do you have a tight or loose labor market? Is it hard to get people or not? If it's an employee's market like it is in 2019, you're going to be probably paying more for your talent. So in terms of the wage spread, guys, let's look at it this way. One of the reasons we have a wage spread in the first place is the idea that somebody doing a more difficult job should probably make more money. If you and I had the same pay and you were doing a far more difficult job than I did, or there was a very small differential, you were making 10 cents an hour more than me, I'm sitting in an office drinking coffee, and you are working in a life-threatening job, that's not a fair wage spread. So the reason we want to have a wage spread, if we look at management, well, we want to make sure that we're showing the skilled folks that we care about and we're keeping them. And we're also giving folks who are not skilled or not making that money some incentive to improve and move forward. If you look at the unions, however, though, they really want to make sure that everybody's getting paid equal for the equal amount of work. That's not to say somebody can't make more money based on union philosophy. Unions are probably going to push for greater amounts of equality than employers are. Employers like price dispersion, wage differential, so that they can actually pay less skilled employees less. So here's an example of how you might have classifications and spreads, for example. If you have somebody, for example, who is low skilled, for example, we have 184 employees who are Class A, and they're getting a 57 cent per hour increase. So that actually might count as very skilled employees, and it's a smaller percentage of the workforce than some of the other ones. Although, if we go down to classification C, those might be janitors, for example, or people with very low skills, as E and F are. The bottom line is that we have different pay rates for different employees, and that we're going to classify them based on, it could be a letter classification, it could be something like a class 1, 2, 3, or 4. These kinds of classifications, by the way, are very big in government work. If you ever hear people talk about their titles in government work and they have lots of numbers and acronyms, it's because a lot of government work is organized labor, and they also pay based on these kinds of systems. So there are also what we refer to as two-tier pay systems. And here's an example. If you had somebody who was hired earlier versus somebody who was hired later, this was a big deal with the negotiations between General Motors and the United Auto Workers. Essentially, what they wanted to say, the management wanted to say is, when we have new hires, we can hire them at a lower pay scale. So you end up with a two-tier pay scale, the people who were grandfathered in under the old plan and the folks who are being hired under the new plan. So some of the arguments that come into place. In terms of wage comparability, the unions and management have reasons to want to make sure that people are being paid fairly within the bargaining units. So we've got multiple skill sets represented in a union. Are all of these people being compensated fairly? And then when we look at the degree of labor intensiveness, it really is easier to get what you want if you're the union, for example, if costs are low to begin with. So if you have a lower cost of the total operation, you can argue for better pay, for example. The ability to pay simply means Can the employer afford to pay you? We talked in class about Hostess, for example, not being financially solvent, and the union essentially was asking for things that Hostess simply could not deliver. Most unions, I would hope at some level, are reasonable enough to realize that their employers also have to make a profit and stay in business, but they will evaluate their employer's ability to pay. Meaning, do you have the money to give us raises? Do you have the money to make better pay scales, etc.? And then we get into productivity. Productivity can harm or hurt someone. Some companies, for example, who are big into productivity may incentivize people being more productive and adding value. Other companies, for example, if you're more productive, may decide they need fewer of you. So unions typically are very cautious when it comes to pushing for productivity as a part of a raise structure. So in terms of the raises and the amount of difference in compensation, if we look at the rates of change in manufacturing output per hour and we compare them between the United States and other countries, we're doing okay. I mean, we're no Singapore. We're not in terms of changing our rates of change. But if we look at 2010 to 2011, yeah, a lot of companies are outpacing us in terms of productivity and change in their manufacturing sectors. All this means is greater efficiency, greater automation is happening places beside the United States. So cost of living, for example. What is the cost of living rate in your area, and what's the inflation rate? Consumer price index, what are we paying for the basic things we need all the time? And the other thing, too, the idea of comparable worth means, okay, if we're making different levels of contribution, again, to use the analogy in the clinic, if you're a brain surgeon and I'm a janitor, chances are you're probably increasing the value of our organization a little more than I am, meaning our comparable worth is a little different. You should make more money than I do. So that's part of how we determine wage scales. So how do we adjust wages? There's something called cost of living adjustments. We call them COLAs. And essentially, we're looking at financial indicators, things like the consumer price index, all these sorts of things, and determining every year, are we giving everybody a little cost of living adjustment? We're talking between 1% and 3% generally here, guys, of your total salary. Nobody's getting rich off these things. And here's the other thing, too. Sometimes the price of healthcare, based on the way things are moving in 2019 and beyond, outpaces our cost of living adjustments anyway. These are not raises that people get excited about. They're raises that people kind of expect. So in terms of multi-year labor contracts, we can do a couple of approaches to this. We can do backloaded, front-loaded, or even loaded. And that backloaded might mean, for example, we know we're coming out of a recession. Let's put the big wage increases later on. Front-loaded means, for example, we want to do the big raises up front because the economy's good right now, but we're anticipating a slowdown, so we'll make them smaller later on in the contract. And then even-loaded means that we make them even the whole way through. Lump sum pay adjustments are things that employers love. Why do they love them? Because you make the payment once and you're done. It's a one-and-done scenario. Whether it's a bonus, whether it's profit sharing, whatever. Instead of saying every year we're going to be giving you an increase in your hourly rate, instead we're saying we're giving you one big lump of cash right now. It's easy from a financial standpoint for people to manage. So in terms of employer costs per hour worked by bargaining status, if we look at what it costs employers to get their jobs done, total compensation, what we mean is if you're paying somebody not just their hourly rate, but if you broke what their benefits cost, divided it by 40 hours a week, and divided that by 52 weeks a year, put that onto somebody's hourly rate. And a union company in the United States, now these are 2014 numbers, they're probably higher now because we're out of the recession. $46.50 compared to $29.83. You can see how these break down. Generally, a rule of thumb, guys, a rule of thumb for benefits in the United States is if somebody makes $100,000 a year, a company's really paying them about $130,000 because your benefits, fringe benefits, compensation that's not necessarily pay, all that stuff adds up to about another 30%. It's a pretty big deal. Well, one of the things we're seeing now, guys, and I know that none of you in here are healthcare majors, at least I don't think you are. Guys, the trend is to move away from traditional, what we refer to as Cadillac plans, to co-payments and cost sharing. Here's the way it works, guys, and traditional healthcare, literally, in the United States with many big industrial companies, the employer paid for everything. They paid for your insurance. You didn't have a copay. You went to the doctor. No matter what it was, it got taken care of. We're shifting more to types of plans where employees, for example, have to pay into their healthcare plans. Very few companies, very few unions have been able to hold on to the old Cadillac plans. So a fee-for-service plans, for example, give a preferred provider organization. That means, for example, you negotiate with a healthcare system and your employees all go to that healthcare system and they get specific services. They used to call them HMOs. PPOs are more common right now. HMOs, for example, are a model that's not quite as popular, but it's sort of a fixed cost system where you would go to an HMO and they would manage all of your healthcare within a single system. The PPO allows a little more flexibility, but you're paying usually greater deductibles, more copays. And a high deductible healthcare plan, this is the big one these days, guys. Here's the way it works. You have a certain deductible you have to hit before major procedures are covered. I'll give you an example. My wife and I are on a high deductible healthcare plan, and right now we have to hit $4,500 worth of medical expenses before our insurance kicks in. Now they'll pay for things like basic exams, annual physicals, those sorts of things. But you also are able to use something called a health savings account. So it means you can have money deducted out of your check on a pre-tax basis, and you can use that money to help meet your deductible. So I have a savings account that I take out before my taxes hit. I can save money in there to make up for the deductible, so I can pay that $4,500 on a pre-tax basis. I can tell you, God bless us, because we haven't had any major medical issues in my family. We've never hit our deductible since we've been on this plan. So it's great for health insurance companies because they're paying less, and it's great for employers because they're paying less. For employees, not so much because we're paying more out of our pockets. So in terms of income maintenance, guys, for example, if you are getting rid of somebody, whether they deserve to be fired or not, if they're being laid off, you may provide them with severance pay. That's up to a lot of different standards. Some companies, for example, if you're fired for a disciplinary reason, will not give you severance pay. Downsizing is very common, for example, to provide severance pay, and that's usually you get a lump sum. Sometimes it's equal to 6 months' pay, etc. If we talk about supplemental employment benefit plans, if you are temporarily unemployed, you see plans like AFLAC, for example. If you were disabled and could not work because of an injury, some of these supplemental unemployment benefit plans will help you keep an income. And then we also have what we call work sharing. Guys, during the recession, a lot of people and companies agreed to go back to part-time. So, hey, you work 20 hours a week, I'll work 20 hours a week. We'll maintain our jobs until the work comes back. It's a very common thing that happens. Obviously, overtime pay is a big deal. Guys, if you are getting overtime, it means if you work over 40 hours a week and you are a non-exempt employee, somebody who qualifies for hourly pay, you get time and a half for working over your 40-hour work week. It's not uncommon for some employers to offer double time for weekends and holidays. In fact, in the old days, the United Mine Workers, you got paid overtime for working on your birthday. Usually, guys, in terms of the overtime, there's always somebody who wants it. It's usually awarded by seniority. We need people to stay. You can make some extra money. The guys who have seniority get the offer first, but they also can refuse it if they don't want to stay for mandatory overtime as well. You might get a shift differential, meaning if you work an undesirable shift, if you're working second trick, which in my opinion is the worst shift to work because you're between worlds, you might get a few extra cents an hour for working. For example, if there's no available work, you show up for work and there's no factory work to be done, GM doesn't need any trucks today, so they're going to send you home. You might get what we refer to as reporting pay. You get paid just for showing up. And again, if you get called in, let's say, for example, you work on-call work, you might get specific pay just for coming in. I know, for example, some professions for people who are on call, they get a minimum of 4 hours pay if they get called out on their time off. So what are some other benefits that you might negotiate your collective bargaining agreement? Obviously, some of these are mandated, some are not. Bereavement leave, very, very interesting issue. Bereavement means you're getting time off. For example, if somebody in your family dies, the number of days you get is typically determined by the closeness of that relative to you. Jury duty, that's federally required. You got to give somebody jury duty off. You get called up to do your federal service, your employer has to let you have that time off. They don't have to pay you, but most good employers do. And most courts will actually pay a minimum stipend if your employer won't. Sick leave is not required by the law in the United States, but you have to give consideration to people if you want to keep them. And sick leave is an incentive to keep people. Military leave, again, it's federal law. If somebody's going to serve, you got to keep the job open for them or an equivalent job. Personal leave, vacation, all these things. Voting leave. Guys, this is one of those scenarios. I don't know if I've ever encountered somebody who was kept from voting because of work, but typically speaking, if you were fired from your job because you wanted to leave to go vote, I think you'd have a pretty good case to get reinstated. So in terms of holidays, guys, most companies will make sure that you have invested in a plan, that you've been there long enough to be able to get paid holidays off. And again, vacations usually are determined by how long you've been working there. Oh, I've been here for 30 years. I get 4 weeks of vacation, for example. And the folks who are there longer with more seniority get preference for scheduling that vacation. Guys, in terms of pensions as well, there's something called the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Big deal these days because so many people are working longer. It means, for example, you cannot force somebody to retire. You can, however, offer them incentives to retire early. If they are given a nice package with certain criteria, you can offer early retirement to people who are making a lot of money in your company. In terms of defined benefit versus defined contribution plans, a defined benefit plan is a traditional pension. It means when you retire, we're going to take care of you and pay you this percentage of what you made while you were here. Defined contribution plans are things like 401ks. You're going to make what you make based on what you put in. So employers can match to a certain point, but generally speaking, it's up to the employee to invest in these plans and to make sure they're looking out for their own retirement. So what is the union effect on pension plans? The bottom line is unions generally want more. Unions want fully paid benefit plans. They don't want individuals to have to pay out of their own pocket. Typically speaking, these pension plans have been big and they've been burdensome. So employers, for example, who are going through the changes of the 21st century are having a harder time keeping these plans solvent. And although there are pension insurance packages, there have been plenty of people over the first part of the 21st century who've lost their pensions due to bankruptcy. And again, a 401k means that you are investing your own money alongside with the companies investing in you. So in terms of an employee stock ownership plan, there are some companies, for example, that will pay with stock. You can get partial ownership. If you hear of companies, for example, that are owned by their employees, you can get paid in stock. Now, unions don't like these plans. Well, why don't they like these plans? Well, because somebody who is a union employee who owns stock in a company may develop a company bias because they want the company's stock to do well. Typically, things that keep stock from doing well are high labor costs, for example. Then we get what we refer to as cash balance pension plans. And that means that both the employee and the employer can put additional money away for the employee, kind of like a savings plan. And you can get that as a lump sum when you retire in addition to your pension or any other retirement you may have. Vesting typically means when you start working for a company, you get vested over a period of years. So let's say, for example, I started at St. Francis University. I may have to work here 4 or 5 years before I get employee benefits. Things like retirement, benefits like tuition for my kids, for example. Typically speaking, the standard model is 5. We call it a cliff vesting schedule. After 5 years, you're invested in the retirement plan. So if I worked less than 5 years, even though I was paying into my retirement, I may get very little or nothing out of it. The Family Medical Leave Act in 1993, here's the bottom line on this, guys. There is no mandated paid time off for medical conditions in the United States. Employers do not have to give you paid time off. However, if you're a full-time employer and you worked at least 1,250 hours in the last year, you have to be given up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to deal with a serious medical condition. That can be a health situation for you or for your family or for your parents or for your children or whoever. Now, if you do have vacation time or sick time, for example, your employer can require you to take that as part of your FMLA, but your FMLA cannot be denied if you're a full-time employee meeting those criteria. There's very few exceptions. So in terms of of earnings, guys, I know we've talked about this a few times in the past, but generally speaking, if you are in a labor union, you're going to have more take-home pay than people in the United States who are not. With that, guys, that's a little discussion about shift differentials and a couple of key terms for you to think about. I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.